list, maybe your wish list for the year. We're going to talk about how to add natives into our landscapes, what a native plant is. We'll do a few minutes on pollinators, who the pollinators are, and what is our focus here. Talk about what makes a plant native, what was it native to, and then how do native plants serve different animals? How do they serve butterflies and moths and bees and other critters out there forming this intricate natural web? We'll spend some time on some key plants that I think are especially good for pollinators and other kinds of critters. And then I'll share some resources. So after the program, where do you go for more help? Lots of great folks on the call tonight. Lots of good information out there between the Master Gardeners, Soil and Water Extension, the Beekeeping Association. So you have a lot of good folks to ask for help. So let's start here. Who are the pollinators? And so, when we're thinking Ohio specifically, we're typically talking about insects. Most of our pollinators, besides the ruby-throated hummingbird, are insects. In the insect world, we have a lot of diversity in our pollinators. We can have moths and butterflies, flies and beetles, but most of our pollinators are bees. And of course, up here in the top middle, we have a honeybee. But we have lots of other kinds of bees in the Midwest, across North America, and here in Ohio. We're not exactly sure how many bee species we have. We think over 400. There's actually a survey that probably some of you are involved with this past year, trying to inventory who are all the species of bees out there. But we think probably upwards to 400 different species of bee. Some of them excellent pollinators, some of them less so, but all of them out there visiting flowers for food. So a couple different approaches to adding natives to your garden or to your landscape, and I assume that's why you're here. You're hoping to incorporate some of those natives where you live, or maybe into a community garden site or a school that you work with, a park. And so one approach is just to put a few plants in here and there, right? It doesn't have to be a whole dedicated pollinator garden, but it could be a dedicated space. Maybe have a little more room to work with, and you want to put lots of those native plants together in one plot, like this pollinator garden in Happy Valley at Penn State. Or maybe you have a little more space and you have a meadow in mind, or maybe you have a prairie that you're working with. So we have a little more ability to put lots of different native plants in and attract a lot of different kinds of pollinators in this kind of situation. So why do we plant natives? Well, there's so many different reasons, right? We have some really outstanding plants out there that add a lot to our landscape. Many of you know Holden Arboretum, and maybe you live close by or you're able to get there a couple times a year. This is an image from their butterfly garden, really outstanding garden, really across the country, but definitely worth a visit. And they've incorporated so many native plants into this butterfly garden. In the middle here, we have mountain mint, Pygmanthemum, one of the top plants, top perennial plants for all kinds of pollinators. Bees and butterflies, flies, skippers, lots of different critters are going to visit that mountain mint. We also have Joe Pye. Someone put that in the comment box. That's one of their favorites. We have a Monarda, the wild bergamot in this image, also some garden phlox. So lots of different kinds of plants that really add a lot to the landscape. Lots of different floral shapes and sizes. These are all different native trees. We have a choke cherry in the middle. We have our amazing tulip poplar. If you're a beekeeper, your bees are definitely visiting those far up tulip flowers in late spring. And then the bladdernut there on the left. I live really close to the Tuscarawas River and the towpath trail. And I have lots of bumblebees in spring visiting that bladdernut when it's in bloom along the tusk. Native plants also are about places to us. These are all wildflowers that were blooming a couple springs ago down at the Arc of Appalachia in Southern Ohio, a place I try to get to at least once a year. Just amazing programs and trails and properties. And those plants, when I see them, they take me back to somewhere I was. Maybe you have some of those plants that were growing when you that were growing where you grow up, and you like to incorporate those into your landscape. They just have a special meaning to us. And then, of course, those natural relationships, and that's what we'll be focusing on. Who are the butterflies that are visiting? Who are the caterpillars feeding on the leaves? What bees are using that plant for forage, for pollen and nectar, or using the stem? There, that hollow stem has some small carpenter bees that are living inside that stem. So what are some of those natural relationships? Sometimes we think of native plants as having fewer pest problems. I think we could probably have a debate about that, whether that's really the case or not. Sometimes native plants have fewer pest problems. Other times, we could think of examples, the emerald ash borer, some of our, unfortunately, our beech leaf disease issues, oak wilt. We can think of some really important native plants and some really key pests as well. So from my perspective, native plants don't have fewer problems, they have different problems, right? We have to kind of learn who are the pests that come along with those native plants. And sometimes they're introduced pests that come to feed on those native plants. Are they better suited to our landscapes? You hear this a lot. They're more adapted because they're from this environment. But I think if, think of your house and what was there before your house, what was your house? Most of us have very disturbed sites. We have soils that are not native soils. They are really interrupted. They've been disturbed. The top layers have probably been removed. They've been compacted. And so even if there's this idea that, we put native plants in, they're really going to do well because they're from this area, but they're not meant to, they didn't evolve in this kind of situation. So native plants aren't necessarily better suited to our landscapes. It all comes back to the right plant in the right place, whether you're talking native or non-native, right? Just because a plant is native or non-native doesn't mean it's going to do well if it's not suited properly. So if it likes wet feet, it needs to be in a moist soil. If it needs full sun, we can't plant it in shade. So always come back to that idea of what plant is in that place, and really site our plants accordingly. So I'm lucky to work with an integrated pest management grant where we're able to grow out flats of native perennials. Well, in non-COVID years, we grow out native perennials, and we distribute those to folks who have pollinator demonstration gardens across the state. So I get to work with folks who have, some really creative sites. This is the pollinator garden at the Smuckers property in Orville. They have a LEED certified building and some beautiful meadows there. And so when I'm working with those sites, of course, we're thinking about pollinators. And of our pollinators, the bees are our main focus, right? The bees are the best pollinators. But we have lots of other animals that are involved in those sites too, right? That are living there, that are feeding on those plants, that are using those plants for nesting habitat, for cover. And so we're thinking about a broader network. And I appreciate that this is kind of small on your screen, but the idea is we're making a sign that'll have these 10 plants that we really feel are great for pollinators. And we're going to talk about some of those tonight. And then who's in that network? Who is dependent on that plant in some way? So whether that's the monarch that needs the milkweed, or another caterpillar that needs a specific kind of plant to feed on, hummingbirds that need the nectar, or butterflies and moths that need nectar, all kinds of bees that are dependent on different plants, other kinds of pollinators, beetles, flies, and wasps. And does this plant also provide seed or nesting habitat for birds? So there are all these really intricate networks that are tied to plants. It's not just a silk plant that's stuck into a landscape. It really has all these natural networks. So what is a native plant? Let's talk about that. What's our definition of a native plant? Of course, here we have a honeybee, which is not a native bee, and then this Coreopsis that is native to certain places in North America. So let's talk about This definition I'm using from Rick Dark and Doug Tallamy's book, The Living Landscape. So a plant or animal that has evolved, okay, so the evolved is important, that has evolved in a given place over a period of time, sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. Okay, so it's the time to evolve. It's not several generations, it's thousands of generations, right? And it's developing these complex relationships, both with the physical environment and other plants and animals that live there. So a plant that was introduced to North America when European settlers arrived to the shores, it's not a native plant, right? Even though it's had many generations, even 500, 1,000 years from now, it hasn't evolved over thousands and thousands of years to form those complex relationships. So here's an example. If you don't know the USDA plant site, USDA plants, it's a great site to go to. Lots of our, most all of our native plants and many of our weeds are indexed on the site. You can get range maps, you can get images, other specific information about those plants. And so here I put in Canada thistle. Right. And so even though Canada's in its name, it's not native to North America. It's a Eurasian plant that was introduced here. And we can see, we can tell that from the USDA plant site because this is in blue. So introduced plants are in blue. We can see that Canada thistle has a huge range across North America, right? But not a native plant. Here's another example. This is Cerseus Canadensis, the eastern redbud. And we can see it's got a wide range from Canada down through the eastern US, a native plant that spans across a good swath of the country. But if we look into New England, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, it's not indicated there, also into the Dakotas and West. One thing that's really nice about this USDA plant site is that we can drill down. You can dig down in that map and look at a specific location, even on the county level. So this is, again, the eastern redbud, drilled down to the county level. And you can see here, Ashtabula County, it's not indicated here as a native to Ashtabula or to Trumbull County. Here I am in Stark County, native here, but not found in Wayne County naturally, or Medina or Lorain. Okay, so it's just a nice way to kind of get a feel. Yes, we see that whole range, but that doesn't mean the plant is necessarily established or well suited across that whole range. Same thing with animals, they can have quite a wide range. So this is the monarch, and we know that monarch range spreads from Mexico, those wintering grounds, and then up through North America, up into Canada. And then we have a Western population that's over in California. Okay, so animals can have a much wider range. It depends if it's a migrating animal. Most of our bees are not migratory, and so they tend to be centered in specific locations. Here's an example of a common eastern bumblebee, Bombus impatiens, is in the oval there in the middle. So mostly an eastern bee. Occasionally there'll be reports of this bee found way far out west, say Oregon or Washington. And it's not native there, right? It's an eastern bee, and there may be a few examples found in outlying situations. Okay, so bumblebees actually have a pretty wide range. And then we can go even more specifically. If we look at Ohio, this is a vegetation map that has come back to quite often. And a friend of mine who used to have a prairie development business, maybe some of you remember Don Beam, a really wonderful prairie expert who passed away several years ago. But he would, and the prairie sites are in yellow on this map, and he would go to remnant prairie areas that he could find and harvest seed from those areas. So he was really looking at ecotypes of plants that were from actual counties. And he didn't want to plant something if he couldn't find a source of that plant that was growing naturally in the county. Okay, so we can talk about a plant that's native to a county. And you could be that specific in your own landscape. I'm only going to grow plants that are native to my county. Right? Or maybe you'll say Northeast Ohio, or maybe Ohio is your range. Why draw the state lines? Maybe you'll do kind of a Midwestern region, or we could be talking about the Eastern US, right? So there are different ways to talk about native plants. And sometimes people will say, well, I will grow anything, it's native to North America. Well, something that's native in California could have very different, doesn't have those ecological relationships with the animals and other plants that we have here in Ohio. So why do natives matter? Well, it's much more than just bees, although our focus tonight is on bees. And I mentioned those 10 plants that we really pulled out in OSU entomology in the Bee Lab as being some key plants for pollinators that are fairly easy to grow, somewhat adaptable in our landscapes. And we're encouraging people to plant more of these to help form these natural networks in your own landscape. And so we've got, some of our great garden natives. We have purple coneflower, baptisia, the mountain mint, the monarda that I mentioned, asters and milkweeds, penstemon. The little yellow one is golden alexanders that you may or may not be familiar with. It's in the carrot family. And it could be a host plant for black swallowtail butterflies. So we're trying to draw people a little bit, we love it that people want to plant for bees, but we want to talk also about those other networks, choosing a plant like ironweed and really look at what are the other relationships besides just bees. I mean, they're great for bees. Ironweed is great for bumblebees, other wild bees, but they also have a lot of resources, nectar and pollen for wasps, for flies that visit, for butterflies. They're actually a host plant for a butterfly. And in the middle, this is a specialist bee. And we'll talk more about specialist bees, but this is a bee that can only gather pollen from ironweed to feed to the offspring. Okay, so it's a very specific relationship. It's a lot like monarchs and milkweed. And we know that the monarch female only lays her eggs on a milkweed leaf, right? That's what the caterpillars eat. So a similar kind of relationship with these specialist bees. The females only gather pollen from these certain plants to feed to their offspring. So if we're not growing ironweed, we don't have a resource to bring that bee into our landscapes. If we do grow ironweed, it's almost like a magnet. In fact, they have a planting at Holden Arboretum of iron butterfly. It's a cultivar of ironweed right in front of the Nature Center. And there are so many of these specialist bees when the ironweed is in bloom. So you only need one or two plants of that native plant to draw in those specialist bees. You don't have to have a whole meadow. Sam Droege, who's a wonderful bee biologist, he likes to talk about 7 flowers, right? 7 individual flowers provides enough pollen for that mom to gather to rear one offspring. So it doesn't have to be an acre or a huge meadow, can just be a few plants. And again, what we're talking about are these networks. How do these plants relate to all the animals that rely on them? And so our milkweed and our monarch, we know that relationship. We know that the milkweed provides the food for the juvenile, for the caterpillar of the monarch, but there are other butterflies and moths that a moth in particular that rely on milkweed for the caterpillars. There are lots and lots of butterflies, bees, and others who nectar on milkweeds. It's one of the best nectar sources out there. It's not a pollen source. It actually has little pollen packets that get stuck to bees' legs, and beekeepers probably have seen this, maybe a honeybee with her leg trapped down in the milkweed. She's stuck on the little pollen packet and sometimes can then pull her leg back out, and she's got those little pollinia, those little pollen packets stuck to her. So milkweeds aren't good pollen sources for feeding for other kinds of insects, but they're a great nectar source. And then that fluff, the seeds and the fluff are used by birds as nesting habitat. And if you happen to know the wool carder bee who cards wool from your lamb's ear, that's what they use to make a little ball of fluff. And then she lays her egg and puts the pollen next to that fluff, that wool carder bee will actually harvest the fluff from milkweed, and she rolls that in a ball, stuffs it in a stem, puts her egg and the bee bread, the pollen and nectar in there. So it can be a source of habitat for those wool carder bees as well. So lots of different relationships here with this one plant. To contrast, and not to pick on Japanese anemone, I love Japanese anemone. I grow it in my front walkway. It's an introduced plant, clearly. Anemones don't have a nectar resource, even our native ones. They just have a pollen resource for pollinators. And so it has a pretty narrow window of who comes to visit that, right? Bumblebees will visit your Japanese anemone. They love to gather that pollen. Other wild bees as well, but not many other relationships. There aren't caterpillars that need Japanese anemone leaves, or there aren't birds that come necessarily to harvest those seeds. So it's not that I'm saying you shouldn't plant Japanese anemone, but just think about those relationships that native plants offer that our introduced plants can't. So many of you are fond of Doug Tallamy, as I am, a really amazing professor, researcher, author from University of Delaware. And he talks a lot about what bird food looks like in his talks and in his books. And sometimes we should think more about seed. I'll put seed out for the birds, or maybe they're eating some of the fruit on my plants. But we know from biology that birds need those insects and spiders to feed the juvenile stage, right? To turn a baby bird into a mature bird, they need lots and lots of insects. And Doug Tallamy in particular talks about the oaks and how important oaks are as a host for so many different moth and caterpillar species for birds to come and feed on. And that even though oaks aren't providing juicy fruit for birds, they're providing this food habitat for, and Doug has teased out 534 different species of butterflies and moths associated with oak trees. So an incredible variety of different moths, some big and showy, some nondescript and tiny, but all of them, the caterpillars are food for birds. And so if we're not bringing that diversity into our gardens with something like an oak, we don't have that diversity of birds that's following as well. Okay, and so to continue with the Doug Tallamy discussion, after he looked at the oaks, he went out to his neighbor's Callery pear tree, this invasive non-native pear that has spread all over. It's a really big invasive problem, particularly in southern Ohio, but it's making its way up into northeastern Ohio. And found only one caterpillar species. Okay, so over 500 species of caterpillars on that oak, only one caterpillar species on the Callery pear. So no bird food there, right? Very few bees will visit Callery pear. Honeybees don't like it. Some small sweat bees, some small carpenter bees may forage on pear, but it's not a very desirable plant from a pollinator perspective as well. And so if we looked at this chart from Doug Tallamy, talking about some of the best woody plants for birds and butterflies, he talks about oaks. Oaks is the number one, right? The best plant for birds and butterflies. And then willow, cherry and plum and crabapple. I have these highlighted because not only are they great for birds and butterflies, but they're excellent for pollinators. Okay, so we can have one oak with potentially hundreds of caterpillar species. Or we can have one ginkgo and, an introduced tree. I love ginkgo. It's beautiful, turns a brilliant yellow when all those leaves drop in a day in the fall. But is, in a way like having a silk tree in the landscape. Doesn't have a lot of diversity of insects that feed on it. Doesn't have birds that are coming to harvest. There's nothing to harvest. And so just very, very poor in the landscape, very not bringing a lot of diversity along with it. So for that clutch of chickadees that needs 6 to 9,000 caterpillars, they're getting a lot from that oak. They're really getting nothing from something like a ginkgo or a dawn redwood or something else, calorie pear that's non-native. So specifically, what do bees need? Well, they need pollen, right? That's the protein source that feeds the young. They need nectar. That's the carbohydrate source, the energy, the flight fuel that keeps them moving around the landscape. They don't, besides honeybees need a water source, but other wild bees don't particularly need a water source. There's enough water in nectar, so they don't necessarily need, a puddle or a pool or a place to get a drink. They need nesting spaces. So our wild bees need bare ground if they're ground nesting bees, or they may need hollow stems or different cavities if they're cavity nesting bees. And they can get a lot of this habitat from plants, right? We can have hollow stems where bees are nesting, and then we have great pollen and nectar sources. So if we look at plants in terms of whether they're trees, shrubs, or forbs, forbs are flowering plants, so typically flowering herbaceous plants. So our trees are providing the habitat in Northeast Ohio and all across Ohio, late winter and early spring. We're really dependent on trees for pollinators. They provide the pollen and nectar source by and large in those early spring days. Then we move a little bit more into shrubs in spring through early summer. And then our forbs really come on. Our perennials are really giving a lot of the floral resource in summer and into fall. So that's not to say that there aren't perennials that are important in spring. If you have a woodland garden, you have spring ephemerals, you know how important those native wildflowers are in spring. But most of us can't recreate that in our garden. So we're really looking to those trees to add the floral resources in spring, and counting on those forbs, those perennials to take us through the summer and fall. And when we can think about this is to create layers in the garden. Again, here we are at Holden Arboretum in their amazing butterfly garden. So we think about those, the layers. We can have an annual layer, hopefully some bare patches of soil in there. Again, good for those soil nesting bees. We have some perennials, we have shrubs, and then we have the tree layer. So having all those layers really provides a lot of diversity in that habitat. Diet diversity is important as well. So we think about all those bees that are out at different times of the year, and how can we provide bloom throughout that season, right? So the trees, as I mentioned in spring, what can bloom in spring into summer, in late summer, and then into fall. Our honeybees, of course, and our bumblebees that have social colonies, they're active throughout many months. And so they need a lot of different plants to come and forage off of, whereas most of our wild bees, our other native bees, besides bumblebees, have a shorter lifespan. They may only be out for a few weeks, and they need just a thin slice of plants that are blooming when they've emerged and when they're feeding. So, so this idea of seasonality is really important with bees. Early in the season, some of our first bees that we're going to see in hopefully by late mid or late March, we'll see some queen bumblebees out there. They overwinter as queens. We may see some Calides, some polyester bees, or some Andrena bees. So we have some wild bees that are out early in the spring. We have others that emerge. Some of our sweat bees are a little later. Our bumblebee workers are out later in the spring. Drones of bumblebees out through typically late summer into fall. And so we have different bees out at different times, right? And we can kind of help to identify bees according to when we see them, and also what they're foraging on. So our queen bumblebee on the right, very early spring, this little mason bee with hairs under her abdomen gathering pollen, also very early spring, spring bee. So aim for year-round flowers. Of course, as gardeners, we love that anyway, right? As much of the year as we can we incorporate some blooming plants into that landscape, starting with the aster or the acer, the maples early in the spring, a good pollen, some of them also a good nectar source. I have redbud here in the middle, a real magnet for lots of different kinds of wild bees. And then all the way through the season, ending up with our asters, a real magnet. Again, lots and lots of different kinds of insects are going to visit your asters. So this leads into this idea of specialist bees. And as I said, with the ironweed, we have a bee that has to visit a specific plant to gather pollen. And so on Aster, although Aster gets lots of different pollinators that come to visit, there are actually 7 species of bees that can only visit Aster for pollen. And that's the Andrina, the bee that's on the right-hand picture. Of course, here's our beloved honeybee visiting this aster. There are lots of other bees that will visit asters, but of all those bees, 7 of them have to visit asters to provide enough food for their young. Okay, here's our ironweed again. If I asked you what color ironweed pollen is, you could probably guess that it's white, right? She's got these long hairs. She's got kind of chaps on her hind legs and has gathered that white pollen from ironweed. Other important plants for those specialist bees are Solidagos and other members of the Asteraceae. Lots of specialist bees. Solidago has 11 specialist bees. So again, we're having a lot more than just 11 species of bees that visit goldenrod, but of those, 11 have to visit goldenrod. Don't think that the pollen specialists are only on herbaceous plants. Here's willow, which is great for both the pollen and nectar source early in the season. But it's also great for specialist bees. There are 11 bees like this Andrina mining bee that have to visit willow for pollen. Okay, they can visit lots of different plants for nectar. We really don't have nectar specialists, but they have to find the right kind of pollen. And then willow's great for other animals as well, right? We have 456 species of butterflies and moths that are associated with willows. So what I'm asking you to do is to plant more natives. I don't think you need to be a purist. It's up to you, right? There are no native police that I know of. So I think a blend, using the entire palette that's available to you is fine. Having a mix of natives and non-natives. When Doug Tallamy talks, he talks about, 75% as a goal. Can you have 75% of your landscape in native plants? And also then incorporate the hostas and the astilbes and other non-natives that you love to create this landscape that you're looking for. Maybe 75% is too high for you. Maybe 50%, maybe 25% is a target. Maybe adding a few more natives right into the landscape that you have. As I said with that ironweed, if you plant just 1 or 2 of those plants, you're going to get that specialist bee coming. So even a few native plants can really make a difference. So let's take a quick walk through the garden season and look at some of those favorite natives. I mentioned the maples already, these anthers full of pollen. So they offer pollen, they offer it to the wind and also to insects that are visiting those flowers. And then some maples also offer nectar, like our red maple. We don't look up close at these flowers very often, but they really are quite showy, even though they're small. And think about it. So, so you have a few wildflowers, a few spring ephemerals in your landscape or something else that blooms early in the season versus having one red maple tree that's in bloom. There are literally tens of thousands of flowers on that tree. So we don't often we don't look up into the canopy. It's hard to see up close what's in there foraging, but there are lots of different bees that are going to be, especially on warmer, sunnier days, that are going to be visiting those tree flowers. Serviceberry, another great native tree. I think you need a serviceberry in your landscape. If you don't have one, you need another one if you already have one. Beautiful white flowers in the rose family. Um, very open, very easy for pollinators to access the reward. And then of course we get these beautiful berries later in the season that are a lot like blueberries in flavor. And good luck if you can beat the birds to them. They're nice to for us to eat, but the birds are watching too. So as soon as mine start to even turn a light kind of pink, I mean, they're ripe when they're purple and blue. And usually the birds have them cleared off way ahead of that. Redbud, again, right plant, right place is important with redbud. They prefer an edge, not full sun, not good right out in the middle of the landscape. But if you can give them a little bit of protection, especially from harsh afternoon sun, you might have good luck with redbud. And a whole assortment of bees that visit redbud, including this little polyester bee who is a soil nesting early spring bee. Of course, I mentioned how much I love oaks, and we think sometimes about these trees that are wind pollinated, that they don't provide anything for our insect pollinators, but actually they do. They don't have flowers that are inviting to those bees, but they do have pollen. And so especially honeybees, when they're out looking for something they can't find other pollen, they're gonna visit oaks and ash and other plants that are wind pollinated. They're gonna visit those flowers and gather that pollen. Our native cherries are really outstanding. Our ornamental cherries are as well, but really, again, wide open apple-shaped, rose-shaped flowers, very easy for different pollinators to access. And we have so many different cherries, from our pin cherries to our black cherries and choke cherries. Important both for the nectar and pollen source, and then also important as a fruit source for birds. And then remember all those moths and moths and butterfly caterpillars that are feeding on those cherries. Some of our most beautiful butterflies and moths rearing their young on those cherries. And here, high up on the list, right after oaks and willows. Move into a couple shrubs, so that we have several native species of shrub dogwoods in the state. Lots of, this is an andrina, a mining bee visiting this shrub dogwood. So very versatile in the landscape. You can have different natives that have colored stems, and that can give you some winter interest. Same with viburnums, a lot of diversity in viburnums. You can have these spread out to bloom at different times throughout the spring. Here's a great big queen bumblebee feeding on this viburnum. Our brambles, our raspberries and blackberries and others, good nectar source, readily available flower. So bees have to figure out how to work flowers, right? They have to learn to work different kinds of flowers, and then they have to remember how to do that. And that's why they tend to be selective and specialists, where they keep coming back. They're faithful to those flowers. They keep coming back, and they've already learned how to work that flower. With something like a bramble, pretty easy to figure out. There are no big tricks to it. The pollen is readily accessible. And especially something like a raspberry, a really nice nectar source. You're going to see a lot of different bees visiting raspberries. And then those canes have the advantage of, if you're cutting the canes back, they're hollow, and our native bees can nest down inside those hollow canes from last year's stems. Doesn't hurt the shrub, but provides a nice nesting habitat for some different bees. Winterberry, here's another one that if you don't have winterberries, you definitely need them. I had robins visiting my front pots. I had winterberry in there along with some evergreen stems for the holidays. And one day the robins just swooped in and ate all those berries. So flowers that are going to offer the pollen and nectar early in the season, in the spring, But then this fruit that develops, and it's going to be nice for birds to visit into the winter. And they tend to like different birds like that freeze thaw cycle. So you don't always see the birds at once, but they watch and they know. Sometimes I'll have bluebirds that come and take all the berries off my Winterberry. Buttonbush, if you have more of a moist soil or a wetland soil, buttonbush is excellent. It has this, this ball-shaped inflorescence with lots of little flowers gathered here. And they're actually pretty shallow flowers. So a lot of different pollinators have different tongue lengths. So small tongue bees and others can really access the food that's here in buttonbush. And we have some selections now that that are good for landscape, so you don't have to have, you know, edge of the pond kind of situation to grow buttonbush. A couple favorite forbs perennials. I mentioned already the golden Alexanders as a source for black swallowtail caterpillars, a food source. Smooth penstemon, you're going to see bumbles come in, kind of work their way in, turn around on your penstemon flowers. I don't try to close the flower on the bee. It's a good way to get stung. That last year. Wild bergamot. So we have several different monardas that are native. Great nectar sources. Hummingbirds love them. Bumblebees are crazy about them. I mentioned milkweeds already. This is a swamp milkweed. Our butterfly weed, the tuberosa, has more of a taproot, so doesn't like to be moved, but put it in a good location. And again, a great nectar source as it's blooming. Purple coneflower, I like to say that if you only have one native plant, why not make it a purple coneflower? You can put a pot on your deck and you'll get the bees, you'll get the butterflies visiting that purple coneflower. Aster is so important late in the season. Also goldenrods. We have so many different kinds of goldenrods. One of my favorites for the garden is Fireworks there on the left. It's a cultivar. That's a really nice spray effect in the landscape. But there's so many goldenrods to choose from. I think maybe Judy will talk about that. Judy's awesome on goldenrods. Of course, she wrote the book on goldenrods. So what about cultivars and hybrids? And so I mentioned the Fireworks goldenrod. It is a cultivar, so it's a horticultural selection that was selected and bred for its ornamental qualities. So sometimes folks are a little hesitant to put those cultivars or hybrids into the landscape for pollinators. We don't necessarily have a lot of research on cultivars and their attractiveness to pollinators. Annie White has done some good work. Mount Cuba has done some good observational work with pollinators and different perennials. The bottom line seems to be that it depends. Right, sometimes the cultivar is fine and we get a lot of good pollinator visitation. Other times visitation diminishes with cultivars. Maybe the floral colors have changed, maybe the pollen or nectar quality have changed, and so pollinators don't prefer those cultivars or that hybrid. Doug Tallamy talks about this as far as caterpillars and which plants that caterpillars will feed on. And so his research has shown that plants that have those, that's why I put that 9-bark, the Coppertina on the left, it's a cultivar of 9-bark. So he's found that plants that have those reddish or purple leaves, those tend to have chemicals that inhibit feeding by caterpillars. Right, so if you're trying to get those caterpillars into the garden, that bird food, you may want to stay away from those colored leaves. But my general advice about cultivars is if you're not sure and for some reason you think you can't live without that double-decker purple coneflower, go ahead and plant it, but also include the straight species in the garden. That's the one that comes true to seed. It's not a horticultural selection. And then watch them. And they do this at Holden in their butterfly garden. They've actually done observational studies looking at lots of different purple coneflower cultivars to see which ones are the pollinators visiting or not. And some of the crazy colors, as you would imagine, you know, some of the greens and maybe the oranges might not be as attractive to an insect that has evolved with this traditional purple color in the straight species. So to wind things up, let me encourage you to do one thing. For pollinators, you probably have a lot of things on your list, a lot of plants you'd like to add, but add one more native plant into your landscape. Maybe have that goal of maybe it's 10% of your plants will be natives, or maybe you have a lot of natives already and you're ready to ratchet it up to 75%. It's really a personal choice, but you'll see the results when you have lots of bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, and birds coming to your landscape. So if you add only one plant, I would pick the Pygmanthemum muticum, the mountain mint, clustered mountain mint. Has this silvery, fuzzy bract on the top, lots of little tiny mint flowers that are going to have good nectar sources a good nectar source for pollinators. It's not a spreading mint like spearmint or peppermint, forms a nice clump, and will be a robust grower if it likes its spot in the garden, but it's not something you couldn't pull the edges out and share it with a friend if it's a little too eager for you. So a couple of resources that I pulled together for you. I made a Go link, the go.osu.edu/natives. Remember, you need the whole http:// to make it work. But I have a collection of fact sheets that I've compiled in one space for you. I have a link to the Ohio Native Plant Month's native plant list that Deb Kanapke and Hope Taft put together. So 200 and something native plants in Ohio. LEAP, the Lake Erie Collaborative, has a native plant nursery map that you're probably familiar with from Northeast Ohio, but if you're not, you can get on there and find native plant nurseries, how many of their plants that different nurseries have, what percentage are natives. And then lots of great fact sheets like this Cerseus. It's hard to go wrong with the Cerseus Society for Invertebrate Conservation. They have some wonderful plant fact sheets that help you choose native plants that are great for pollinators wherever you are. This is the Great Lakes region. I also use the Midwest list quite a bit. So here's my contact information. My main website is blab.osu.edu. There's my email. If you think of any questions, I welcome you to contact me by email. And I'm happy to take some questions. Here's my ironweed that I'm ending with at Dawes Arboretum with lots of Queen Anne's lace in the backyard. Don't disparage your weeds. They're really important for pollinators too.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Denise. And now would be the time where there's a huge round of applause. You'll just have to take mine. I'm sure everybody else is clapping from home. And just a ton of great information, and there's people coming in the chat saying excellent presentation and thank you and thanks for all the information. So I want to share that. Before we get into the question and answers, remember down at the bottom, there's a Q&A button. You can type in your questions that you have about the presentation or questions you want to ask Denise. We can hang around for a little bit and ask a couple questions. But before we get to that, let me remind you that when you exit this program, if you hop off early or if I end the program at the end of the night, you will be redirected to a survey. And we just ask you, please fill out that survey. It helps let us know how we did. It lets us know how the presentation went and what we can do to improve for next time, what kind of presentations you want to hear at our next Pollinator Symposium. So, what we can offer for the next one depends on people filling out that survey. So share a little bit of information about yourself. It takes less than 5 minutes. I know it's getting late, but it's real quick. And then the other thing was tomorrow you'll be getting an automated email that will have a link to our website. I put it in our chat box as well. Our website, excuse me, for the Pollinator Symposium has Denise's a link to her webpage that she shared, the natives one, and it will have all the resources for all the other presentations. So if you want to get in contact with that, it's kind of a one-stop shop for information, or you can go straight to her webpage that I also put in the chat for you. So I appreciate everybody for being able to join us tonight, and thank you again to Denise for the excellent presentation. I learned a ton, and let's go into some questions while we have time, while people are still on. And a ton of people are saying thank you in the chat. All right, so the
Thanks, everyone.
first one was from Reese Davis, and he said, how do you gather data to put together the Great Plains and Great Networks diagram?
So I am just amazed at bee researchers and what they do. And I'm not a bee researcher, I'm an educator, right? I'm an extension educator. The bee researchers are really amazing. And so, for example, Dr. Karen Goodell, who's with OSU, she's a biology professor who does research down at the wilds in Cumberland, Ohio. She studies which bees nest in, if you know the wilds, it's a reclaimed strip mine. Where they have a lot of native plants that they've reseeded, and they also have some remnant forests there. And so she studies which bees nest in different areas and which flowers do they visit. And so this idea of these pollinator networks is something that bee researchers work with all the time. Mine was really simple, right? I only have 10 plants and 10 different, examples of animals that are associated. But she has such complicated networks that you can hardly read it, right? There's so many lines. And what they're studying then is if a plant is removed from that landscape, which string is pulled, which network is weakened by that plant being removed. This doesn't necessarily mean that that's the pollinator of the plant. So you could have a pollinator network as well. And so then if the pollinator is removed, how do other animals and other plants kind of adapt and react to that removal. So if you just Google pollinator networks, I think you'll see, look at the images. It's just really incredible what bee scientists do.
Excellent. So there was another question. Someone asked, Allison Anderson asked, any specific kind of oak? And I think that might be referring to oak wilt disease.
Oh, for oak wilt. So there are, I think it's the reds. Do I have that right, guys? The red oak group. There's a white oak group and the red oak group. And I think the red oak group is more susceptible to oak wilt. I've been out of the plant path world for quite a while now, but I think you could find a good fact sheet that talked more about oak wilt. As far as susceptibility, I don't know that you could find, resistance information or, plants, oaks that are less susceptible by species, but by that group.
Yeah. I know William Riccio asked earlier. So if you go to the answered section, he was asking about oak wilt, and I just put in there that it's a fungus and the pathogen name, and then I linked an article to the Michigan State fact sheet on that. So if anyone does have questions, Michigan State has a really nice fact sheet on that. So next up, Donald asked, we use an injection to combat the ash borer. If it goes directly into the tree, is it harmful to pollinators?
So I think you could find some research done by Dan Herms and others on that as well. But I think in fact, there's a Michigan publication, Andrew, maybe I can get you that link, that really looks at management strategies for emerald ash borer and potential effects on pollinators. I want to say that those injection products aren't transferred into pollinator nectar, but it would be nectar on the ash. But it depends on the product, and I'm just not familiar with all those different chemicals that might be used, but it is a question that could be answered. I'm just not the person to answer that.
Yes. All right. Yeah, if you need more information, Donald, you can definitely send me an email and I can get you some more information on that.
I think it's the Michigan Urban Pollinator Guide. If you Google some
Okay.
assortment of that, it'll come up, and it's actually a really great bulletin that looks at all different facets of protecting pollinators. It's not just urban areas.
Yeah, we'll have to check that out, link that onto our webpage. Uh, Anonymous attendee asked, only purple coneflower, are other colors less attractive to pollinators?
Right, and so as I was saying, at Holden, they'd actually done some research there, looking at some of the different cultivars. I don't know if they have a fact sheet or have published any of that, but there are definitely some concerns about some of those weird colors that may not be as attractive.
Excellent. Deborah Schelling asked, what was a good plant for mason bees?
So mason bees they like plants in the rose family. So they're excellent fruit tree pollinators. They like cherries and apples in the spring, and they're really out. They're right in sync with those early spring fruit trees. So if you have crab apples, you're going to see masons, or your orchard apples.
Excellent. Cassandra Hoover asked, any favorite places other than Holden to see great examples of native plants in Northeast Ohio, or ideas for places to go to see them in more traditional landscaping settings? And I just want to do a plug for Ashtabula County. We have a couple great metro parks that have pollinators in them. We have a pollinator garden at the Conneaut elementary school that our master gardeners are involved with, and Carol Blake is involved with. And then Red Brook, we have some pollinator plantings at the Metro Park in Red Brook. So if you're in Ashtabula County, check out some of our pollinator gardens. But Denise, is there any other ones in Northeast Ohio that you're fond of?
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing those up in your neck of the woods. I know the Cleveland Museum, excuse me, the Cleveland Museum of Natural History has some great properties as well, and sometimes they have visits that you can make to some of those.
Excellent.
Holden Arboretum comes to mind.
Awesome. Let's see. Someone said,
Oh, I'll jump in. Reese mentions that Heather Holm will be coming out with a
yes.
new book on wasps, and I actually just booked her. We're excuse me, we're doing a Welcome Spring Authors Speaker Series, and pardon me, Doug Tallamy will be the 22nd of March for that, and Heather's going to be the 23rd. So I'll have information on Heather's talk on wasps.
Excellent. NC Morawski asked, if you have spearmint plant trapped inside a deep pipe, might there be a problem of mountain mint planted nearby crossing with it and creating a Frankenstein monster? Now that's a good question.
That's an interesting plant. I think they're distinct enough that they wouldn't cross, and you'd have to save the seed, right? Anyway, to plant that out if it was a cross. I think more it's the spearmint that's trapped inside your deep pipe that's mad at you, and you don't want to make spearmint and peppermint mad because they're going to come out everywhere, right?
Awesome. Someone asked for a good shrub for late season blooms.
So a native shrub that's good for late season blooms. I mean, the first shrub that came to mind for late season bloom is Rose of Sharon, which is not native. We don't have as many shrubs, later in the season. If folks put something in the chat, if it comes to you, there's a lot of good knowledge in the room. Yeah, I'm not thinking, when we talk about that phenology, our trees are really done by the time we get to basswood. Shrubs are good into the summer. I'm just not thinking of any late season blooming shrubs.
Someone said witch hazel.
Sure, like that. Yeah, which I think of it as more tree form, but right, that Virginiana, Hamamelis virginiana, the late blooming yellow witch hazel. Yeah, good thought.
Franklinia. Is that what that is?
Franklinia, yeah.
Yeah.
If you can get Franklinia to grow, I'm really excited for you. I can kill it. I'm trying again this year.
Debbie Schaefer asked, you mentioned 400 species of bees. Was that all in Ohio, or is that in North America?
So in North America, we have about 4,000 species of bee, and then we don't know exactly how many species in Ohio. They just did a survey in Michigan. I think they were at, I want to say 365, and we're just beginning the bee survey in Ohio. So we just don't know how many species we have, but probably somewhere around 400.
Excellent. Yeah, it's amazing how many there are, and yeah, it's hard to tell.
Yeah.
There's so many. All right, Christine Pappas asked, what native Viburnum, or oh, hold on, I can't pronounce that. Viburnum, sorry, are resistant to the beetle, and she said she lost some to the beetle. Is there any
Okay.
natives that are resistant to that?
Sure. So that's a great example. So the Viburnum leaf beetle is a non-native beetle, and it especially likes our native Viburnum. And if you think about it, the Viburnum that beetle evolved with, those plants are resistant to that feeding because they evolved together. And so that non-native beetle, it's our native Viburnums are virtually defenseless, and so they can be easily defoliated in one season. Twice defoliated, and that's the end of the Viburnum. The good news, I think, is that Viburnum leaf beetle came through Ashtabula down from New York, right? It wasn't your guys' fault. It came through Ashtabula into, now I think it's in Delaware County, so about central Ohio, kind of in this wave across the state. And in places where the wave is gone, has gone through, the Viburnums tend to be rebounding somewhat. So it may get a little easier for you as time goes by. You may have less pressure. But if you look on Cornell's website, and I haven't looked for Viburnum leaf beetle for quite a while, but Cornell used to have a rating scale from susceptible to virtually resistant. So you could go in there and try to see. I don't know that you're going to have many choices as far as native Viburnums, but again, maybe time will be on your side and you'll be able to put back. Like I have a snowball Viburnum that is native, that it went through some defoliation, but it's kind of coming back now. There's not as much beetle pressure. So fingers crossed.
Excellent. We still have quite a few questions rolling in. I want to be conscious of your time, Denise, and if you say maybe 10 more or whatever, that's fine. If or we can go.
I'll say 10 more. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
I have an old dog. I was telling Andrew before we started, who is blind, and he's kind of got some sundowners, and I was worried that he wouldn't relax, but he's chill. So I'm good to take a few.
So two people, Craig and Shelley, both asked about shaded areas and natives that grow well in the shade. Do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, they're actually, so it depends what you're looking for. There are quite a few shrub choices for shade. You're gonna, if you think of the trees, would be redbud and serviceberry. It depends how dense the shade is. Really dense shade is going to be difficult, and if it's dry shade, that's hard as well. So your spring ephemerals are going to be good for, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just reading the chat. Someone said spice bush.
Mm-hmm. Sure. A spice bush, excellent in a good shady spot. In fact, I just ordered some spice bush from the Soil and Water plant sale. So plug, I bet you guys have a good plant sale as well.
Yeah. Yep. The Ashtabula County Soil and Water has tree sale going on now too, and they have smaller shrubs. So check that out if you're in the area. So let's see. What else do we have? Let's see. Someone says they have an area planted to wildflowers, but it seems the weeds grow faster. Are there any tips? That was from Jeff Fenton.
Yeah. So Jeff, you might be, I'll assume that you're thinking about kind of a meadow sort of situation where it's a sunny, lots of herbaceous forbs, perennial wildflowers. And it's hard to get them established to overcome the weeds, and then it's hard to keep the weeds out. So getting that site established is really important. So clearing out the weeds before you start, making sure you're not planting into, anything that has Canada thistle or some of our perennial grasses that are tough. And then it's just kind of continually coming back in and trying to, succession. Once the weeds want to win, and they find a way to elbow in. So it can be an ongoing process. But if you go to the Bee Lab website, I do have a section that's just on establishing those meadows for pollinators. And they're not fact sheets that I wrote, but I have pulled in information from other sources on preparing your site for wildflowers and how to deal with some of those weed situations as you go.
Excellent. Someone mentioned that Trumbull County Master Gardeners have a demonstration garden at the extension office in Cortland, and I've had the pleasure of being there multiple times, and they have an excellent garden and location at the extension office. So if you're around Trumbull County and you want to check that out, that's not so much right now in the wintertime, but in the summer and fall, it's beautiful.
Well, like I said, I think, it's so great. You have so many good resources between the master gardeners, you have volunteer naturalists in that region, folks from the museum or beekeeping association. There's so many good folks to kind of inform those questions of, what do I plant where, what'll do well for me, and how do I manage different pest problems.
Yeah, and if you do have a question that we don't get to, I encourage you to reach out to your local master gardener's office in your local county or your local extension office, or any of the resources that we shared tonight, and they'll be happy to answer some of your questions. There's another comment about the Geauga Master Gardeners have a pollinator garden at the fairgrounds at Burton too, and I've seen that one, and that one is good. I don't want to leave any of the other counties out. A lot of these counties are involved in great pollinators. And Reese mentioned that the Redbrook planting that I mentioned came from a grant from you. So the native plants there are through a grant that you helped out with.
Yeah, right. So those sites are going to get those 10 plants, and that network that I talked about with all those lines is going to be the sign that'll go in those gardens, so we can help people kind of understand the connections in their plants. I'm going to put the Bee Lab website address in the chat box. And then back a little ways, I mentioned, so some of you may have come to our Living Landscapes speaker series. We've run 3 of those sessions. We have one more this coming Saturday with Rick Dark, who's an amazing landscape designer. He calls himself a landscape ethicist, talking about how to observe and bring the living landscape alive. It's a free webinar, and I'll just type that. And we also have the recordings there from the Doug Tallamy talk last week, and put that website in for you.
Excellent, thank you. And
what are you doing? So register for the Doug Tallamy, for the Rick Dark session.
And we still have a lot of people on. We're retaining viewers, and we'll do 4 more questions here, and then we'll let you go. One question that was asked from Marissa Coleman was, they're farming on 2 acres in Avon Lake, and they have a lot of natives already on their property, but they would like to get more milkweed, but the property stays wet until summer. Is that a problem? I have a guess. I've learned about milkweed a little bit recently from my master gardeners. What about swamp milkweed? Would that be a good option?
Yeah, we have a really great resource from ODNR. Have you ever seen it's either Milkweeds and Monarchs, or is it Monarchs and Milkweed? It's a beautiful publication, so. And it talks about many of our native milkweeds. I'm definitely not a milkweed expert, so I don't know all the different species, but again, right plant, right place. So picking something that's more suited, like the swamp milkweed, for that kind of situation where tuberosa, doesn't like clay, doesn't like wet feet.
Excellent. All righty. What else do we have? Someone asked about soil prep prior to planting native plants. Do you have any suggestions on that?
I guess here, I'm sorry, I'm going to try to find that.
Is it from the NWF?
No, it's an ODNR,
Oh, okay.
Ohio ODNR. Yeah, but we
Okay.
can, yeah, try to find that.
I'll look that up. Yeah.
So soil amending for native plants, and I guess it depends if we're talking about shrubs or trees or perennials, and there's so many different, right? So many different plants and so many different needs. But if let's talk about a meadow. Excuse me. Take a drink.
I did find that that file, and I'm putting it in the chat, Denise, for the milkweeds and monarchs from the ODNR.
Super, awesome. So in a meadow type situation, we're not really thinking about amending soil for natives. I mean, we hope that our natives are a little tougher and can adapt to different soils. And sometimes if we have too rich of a soil, I mean, you've had this experience, right? Where your native perennials are just enormous and kind of end up taking over because the soil is a little too rich. So they can sometimes do better in a less amended soil. Trial and error is going to help you decide too whether you need to get some compost into your soil to have them do well, or you can kind of have them do okay without adding a lot of amendments.
Excellent. I'm looking to see if we have any more.
Oh, I'll get Linda Dole.
I was going to say, yeah.
Distinguish the queen bumblebee from the workers. So time of year is going to make a big difference. The only bumblebee that survives the winter is the queen, and she's the really big bumblebee, about as big as your thumb, that you're going to see early in the spring. So you see the queen out around the time that Virginia bluebells are blooming. And then usually 3 weeks or so later, we'll see the workers, which are much, much smaller. So time of year is one indication, and size. No other bumble is going to be as big as that queen. So we see them early in the season, and then at the end of the season, we see the new queens released. So it depends on the species, but usually by late summer, early fall, then the new queens are going to be released again, just large and chunky, and then they're going to be overwintering.
Excellent. So there's two questions. Guy Del Prince and Timothy Gary both asked a similar question about honeybee colonies, asking if they're still suffering from colony collapse syndrome, and if the bee species in Ohio are declining. So is there anything you want to touch on as far as that issue?
Sure. So we used to call this this issue with honeybee losses, colony collapse disorder. And now we talk more generally about all these different stresses on honeybees, including varroa mites and viruses, lack of habitat, pesticides. So there are all these stresses that are affecting bees. And definitely those are just as relevant now, if not more so than they were back when colony collapse kind of came into the news. And our beekeepers online can relate and can know more about this than I do. I work with Reed Johnson, who's a faculty member in entomology who studies honeybees, studies varroa and different genetic aspects of honeybees. So we're definitely still concerned about honeybees. There are great losses in our honeybee numbers. The other part of that question was, are wild bees facing the same kind of losses, I think was what you said. And they have different stresses, right? So pesticides would still affect our wild bees. Wild bees don't get varroa, but they can get different kinds of diseases. Some of those viruses can actually be spread at flowers. It's like a singles bar for bees. Different bees visit, different viruses are spread from species to species. And so they can share a lot of the same issues and threats. Not having enough flowers is stressful for lots of kinds of bees. So all of us planting a few more plants that bees love, including native plants, is going to help honeybees, bumblebees, other wild bees.
Excellent. I think that's a great spot to end on, and I want to thank you again, Denise, for all the information and for coming and speaking with us tonight. And we'd love to have you back sometime, maybe in person.
Be great. We'll go out in the landscape and we'll be socially distanced with our nets and we'll look for bees. So
Exactly. I can't wait until the day. I can't wait. And for everybody else that's still on, thank you for joining us for this first program in the series. And we got 4 more coming on. I hope all of you that are still on will join us in 2 weeks. We're going to be talking about invasives. We're going to be talking about identifying them, eradicating them, and native alternatives, which will be really, really interesting. And you're in luck because I am one of the presenters for that presentation. It's going to be me and Reese Davis from the Asheville County Master Gardeners, and we have a really nice presentation put together for you. We're going to be talking. Reese is going to be telling you about the natives and what to replace the invasives with, and I'm going to teach you how to kill them. So tune in next February 17th, same place, same time. You'll get an email. And thank you all for joining. Remember, please fill out that survey at the end. That helps us out a lot. I think that's all we have to say for tonight. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe. Thanks, Denise.